welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and on this series of programs, we examine issues of interest to the Guyanese population at home and in the diaspora. And today we want to look at a very popular drug, ganja. Some people call it grass, some people call it kaya, some people call it pot, some people call it weed. And it is much misunderstood. But it is not a plaything, and we need to understand that many lives have been destroyed. I personally know about half a dozen families in which a young ganja user, had started to steal his mother's property and started to do things, drop out of school, drop out of university. And eventually, the family broke up because they couldn't feed the habit. From ganja, they move on to other drugs. Uh, Make no doubt about it. Marijuana is a mind-altering drug. It's mind-altering drug. And we in Guyana are familiar with it because it used to be legally imported in the 1860s, 160 years ago. Many indentured Indian laborers used what they call ganja, which is a Hindi word for marijuana, which is a Spanish word. And as a result of that, people just use it as a stimulant. But it is happy, and of course, in Guyanese folklore, there's the well-known song "Ganja Mani." Sell me 1 shilling, give me 1 shilling, ganja mani. Of course, mani is the Portuguese abbreviation for Emmanuel, who was a shopkeeper who used to sell ganja. So that's his name, ganja mani. Um, but now it is very serious. It has moved, from a sort of household level production to industrial scale production. It is no longer a sort of cottage industry. It is becoming a national industry. It's scary. Um, Last year, well, up to now, this year, it is the most confiscated narcotic. 94% of all the narcotics confiscated for marijuana. 94%. And Kanu uh, reported that it seized 1,363 kilos of drugs of ganja last year, 1,000 kilograms of. So apart from the fact that there is some historical basis or historical roots for ganja cultivation, of course most of it is now homegrown. We need to look toward the dangers that it poses to women and young people. And there is in Guyana what they call a ganja zone. And ganja production is located mostly in Region 8, that is Pataro Separoni, Region 10, that is the Upper Demerara, and in Region 6, East Berbice Quarantine. So if you look at a map, there's a waste. The Guyana map has a waste, and there's a belt from Region 8, Region 10, and Region 6, where most of the ganja is produced. So if you're looking for ganja, that's the place to go. And the police know that very well. The police know that if they're looking for ganja, they have to go to Region 8, Region 10, and Region 6. That is the Guyana's ganja zone. And geographically, it is probably the only part of Guyana which straddles all three main rivers, Demerara, Essequibo, and Berbice. And of course, the soil and the climate and all the conditions are suitable for ganja production. Most of the marijuana fields are there. And I can tell you this because over 30 years ago, I was a member of the National Drug Law Committee. And all the reports you're getting today from the police, they can just pull out from the files and make the same reports. All the names are similar. The areas are hardly different. And the police know that very well. So whenever they want a good report, they just go to one of these areas, in the Berbice River. I don't want to call names now, but certainly, when you talk about Kiowa, Gateway, or Develt, um, that is part of the marijuana zone. In 2021, they seized 1,900 977 kilograms of ganja. In 2022, they see 3,280 kilograms of ganja. Last year, it was down to 1,363 kilograms again. This year, between January and April, they've already seized 1.1 tons of ganja alone. 2024. Yes, that is what is happening at Biruni in the Berbice River. That is what is happening at Kiowa in the Berbice River. That is what is happening at Gateway in the Berbice River. Marijuana production is soaring. It is responding to demand, and so the people who supply it are producing for the market. But we have to look, my friends, at the social impact of marijuana production. And yes, marijuana production and trafficking is rampant. And next to murder, marijuana production and trafficking is the most important or most significant crime which people are convicted in this country. Next to murder, ganja production and trafficking are the most serious crimes. And it is responsible for the majority of women being incarcerated in this country. Not fraud, not larceny, not fighting, narcotics possession and trafficking. 1 out of 5 young persons who are destitute, who you find lying down on the street, are there because of drug dependency. It is a major cause of destitution of young people due to drug dependency, because they become marijuana users. So we're not talking about a harmless, we're not talking about candy. We're not talking about the harmless narcotics. We're talking about something which leads to poverty, imprisonment, destitution, and perhaps death. Now, it is also responsible for some of the disorders such as psychosis and mental health problems. So many of the users develop dependency on this drug, and that is when it becomes habitual, and that is when it leads to other social problems. We all know the story from the medical profession. Yes, some of the derivatives from cannabis um, could treat asthma, could treat glaucoma, could treat seizures, could treat nervous system disorders and nausea and vomiting. Vomiting, especially people who are undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. So it is true. It is true that there are medical benefits for some of the extracts from the derivatives of marijuana. But it could also have other side effects. And we know the medical value, and many countries, I think even Jamaica, started to export some of the derivatives which are used in medicine. And of course, everybody in the Caribbean must be aware of the link between Rastafarianism and the use of that particular narcotic. Um, I don't know that there's actually a biblical encouragement for the use of marijuana. But what is clear is that there's no biblical uh, prohibition against its use. And some uh, Rastafarians and some people who claim to be Rastafarians say it's a holy herb. And for that reason, they claim that they have a right to use it. And they claim that it is a contributory factor to their good health. And in Guyana, we have what is called a Rastafarian Council, and there are several groups like uh, the 12 Tribes of Israel and the Theocracy Order of Nyabingi and the other groups. And they have led protests And some other individuals have called for decriminalization of marijuana. In fact, the Caribbean community, as well as had established a commission a few years ago to study, and they made recommendations about decriminalization of possession of marijuana. But what is the impact on society? It is, in fact, um, still a crime in Guyana to possess marijuana. I think about 30 grams, and it could lead to mandatory sentences of uh, 3 years. And in fact, during my presidency, I had released, particularly at Christmas time, women who had been imprisoned for trafficking in small amounts of marijuana, but not industrial scale, and certainly not cocaine. But the majority of women who are imprisoned for narcotics are for trafficking in ganja. And about 54% of the women who are imprisoned for trafficking in narcotics are accused of trafficking or convicted of trafficking in marijuana. And many of the young people who are convicted uh, for various crimes are convicted for trafficking in marijuana. So our jails are being filled up with persons who are convicted for marijuana. In fact, 141 persons are now serving jail sentences for trafficking in marijuana. So it's a very expensive crime in terms of the effort to eradicate countrywide. And of course, the, the criminal justice system and the imprisonment. And when you consider it probably costs about $3,000 to $5,000 to maintain one prisoner a day, you can see a lot of money is being spent on you know this imprisonment, because that is the main response by the government. There is, of course, some attempt to rehabilitate prisoners, and I think the Salvation Army and the Georgian Public Hospital Corporation and maybe other social groups and NGOs are involved in rehabilitation. But cure is, as the saying goes, not necessarily better than prevention. And I think in Guyana we need to aim first at prevention. Every week, every week, about 3 persons are charged for narco trafficking, and mainly for marijuana possession and cultivation. Every single week, about 3 persons are charged for narco trafficking. It's very expensive to try to eradicate or suppress the use of marijuana in this country. We often refer to the State Department's International Narcotics Control Strategy report, and every year they make the same point. Narco trafficking and narcotics production are largely the result of insufficient resources, weak law enforcement, weak or ineffective judicial system, and not surprisingly, inadequate pay for public servants and public safety officers. You pay them poorly and they perform poorly. And these are some of the officials who either turn a blind eye or maybe even facilitate narcotics cultivation and production. And certainly, when you hear about the security forces using drones, you wonder why they don't send drones up the Berbice River or into Region 10 or into Region 8, where there are known areas of marijuana cultivation. So if you may argue, if people are serious about the eradication of marijuana, they can find within a matter of days, but it doesn't take 30 years to know where marijuana is being cultivated and produced in Guyana. Guyana, of course, is signatory to Inter-American Conventions Against Corruption and also to certain international agreements to suppress the trade in illegal drugs. And although these conventions sometimes have provision for the seizure of property obtained through production or through corruption, in Guyana it is not implemented normally, and people who are involved in these crimes normally don't have their property confiscated. What has been the official approach? The official approach is punishment. Well, punishment is not always the best way to eradicate a crime. And imprisonment as a tool um, does not necessarily suppress supply, and it doesn't necessarily suppress drug use. And from the figures I quoted a couple of minutes ago, you can see the production, the cultivation and production of cannabis or ganja or marijuana is continuing to rise. I mean, this year alone, we're talking about over a ton. Once there are weak enforcement measures and there's endemic corruption within the law enforcement agencies, it's difficult to eradicate now marijuana, difficult to eradicate the industry. And I don't say it's a good example. Many people like to speak about how well managed Singapore is. You check the reports, check Al Jazeera, you go to the sources. Singapore had recently executed a person who was convicted of trafficking in 1 kilogram of marijuana. The sentence is death. And several other Asian countries, if I'm not mistaken, certainly I think China, maybe Korea, maybe Vietnam, the punishment for trafficking in drugs, in narcotics, is death. And of course, you got to be, you know, you may want to consider whether those harsh penalties um, are responsible for Singapore being a well-managed, drug-free economy. Because I think people who venture into the drug trade would know the likely outcome would be death. Uh, I'm not saying there's a comparison. I'm not recommending a death penalty, but definitely, I think people in the government must either decide whether they are going to eradicate the illegal production of drugs or the production of illegal drugs, or they're going to tolerate. And I think there's no middle room for vacillation. Um, and I think this has been going on for a very long time. And every government has to face the question of eradication of illegal narcotics. It is doing harm. And even though we pass legislation, the legislation is on the books. We do not use our law enforcement agencies and our investigative arms of the state to obtain drug convictions. We have the Narcotics and Psychotropic Drugs Act since 1990. This is under the PNC administration, Mr. Hoyt. The Anti-Money Laundering and Countering the Financing of Terrorism Act. And this is updated from time to time. Interception of Communications Act. All these are criminal law procedures. We know these things exist, but enforcement has been weak. And we must ask ourselves why. And we ask ourselves what are the consequences of this lack of enforcement. We know all of the conventions. Guyana is signatory to these conventions, but then again, compliance has been very weak. What is the situation of Guyana in relation to uh, the cultivation and production of narcotics? There is reliance on the Georgetown Public Hospital Corporation psychiatric unit, which provides services for persons who are perhaps addicted to the drug. And we know that there is some level of education in the school system. But we know what happened in other countries, say no to drugs and drug wars and so on. And these things have never worked. There are non-governmental organizations like the Phoenix Recovery Project, Salvation Army Men's Center. But for some reason or the other, the approach to illegal drug cultivation and consumption the approach has not been a successful one. And we need to examine what needs to be done if we're going to focus on eradication and protect society against the obvious dangers of illegal cultivation and consumption of these drugs. The CARICOM, the Regional Commission on Marijuana, I think several years ago, produced a report with a very classy name called Waiting to Exhale. But it is sometimes very dangerous to copy, you know, conventions and practices from the developed countries, which have well-developed, orderly law enforcement agencies. They have laboratories, they have police forces, they have anti-drug agencies. So when countries without these institutions copy, you discover that there are whole zones of the country taken up not with food production, not producing sweet potatoes and pumpkins and carrots, but producing ganja. And it's not enriching the farmers, it's enriching the persons who ship these commodities overseas or who market these commodities even locally. So who gains? So the moment you uh, express tolerance for the cultivation of an illegal drug, the people who can afford to buy the tractors and the people who have the go fast boats are the ones who will reap the profits, not the poor farmers of the rivers, but the businessmen who are interested in financing the cultivation and production and marketing of these drugs. That is something that the CARICOM Regional Commission was examined. They ask, they ask, but they cannot direct, they cannot compel. They ask that the governments must make sure that small farmers are included in any production. There's a tendency to allow marijuana to be cultivated, and they ask that the small farmers should be included in production and supply uh, arrangements with appropriate control. The fact is, many of the governments are too small and weak to control the production and cultivation of these drugs. And the big enterprises are going to be the ones that profit. If it's a question of extracting certain uh, oils and other chemicals from narcotics, many small farmers cannot afford to do that. It will be done by the big enterprises and sometimes foreign enterprises. So it has already gone out to the hands of the small farmers and the villages. It is, already in the hands of the people who can provide the tractors and people who provide, the transportation, and perhaps people who can prevent the law enforcement agencies from eradicating the production. Unfortunately, it is impossible to celebrate, corruption from cultivation in this country at present. It is impossible to celebrate, corruption, and this is what we need to be aware of when we're talking about policies in this country, um, particularly in regard to narcotics trafficking and cultivation of this particular drug, ganja grass, weed, pot, or marijuana. There is insufficient funding for CANU. That is a fact. CANU just does not have the capability to cover the country, much not even to cover the three zones that I mentioned in region number 8, region number 6, and region number 10. It calls for boats, it calls for drones, it calls for aircraft, it calls for personnel on the ground. And once the agency is deprived of sufficient funding, it means cultivation production will continue. And people hardly know that there is an anti-narcotics agency called the Police Anti-Narcotics Unit. It's a very low-level unit. I think it may be part of the CID, but it's hardly effective because they just make a trip up the Burbis River every week, and they can get a good report, because once you go up Burbis River on the weekend, you will find narcotics, and they know where to go. The question is that these agencies are starved of funds. There's financial starvation, which in a way guarantees that cultivation production will continue. Many of the marijuana growers are poor. They're, you know, just ordinary farmers in the villages. Many of them are women. And of course, for obvious reasons, the cultivation takes place in the near hinterland, not the far hinterland. And it is the areas are easily accessible. And that is why, Kanu can claim big successes. But the successes are not in terms of eradication. Perhaps they control narcotics production, but they don't eradicate narcotics production. My friends, if we are going to be serious about protecting our women, preventing them from going into prison for this so-called crime of trafficking in marijuana, if we are to protect our youths, to prevent them from becoming addicted, habitual users of an illegal drug, if we are going to protect these huge sections of the community and the country from being marginalized, if we are to prevent poor people from being exploited by rich people, because some people are getting rich from marijuana trafficking, and they're not the small farmers and the growers. They're the people who are marketing and exporting the crop. But if we are to protect society from the scourge of illegal drugs, if we are to protect society from the dangers which are clearly depriving women and youth of a good life, we need to change our strategy and decide if we would eradicate ganja production or encourage ganja production. And my view is that we must take the decision now to put people in front of profits. And right now, marijuana cultivation and production is not a profitable business for poor farmers. A few people are getting rich, but many women and young people are getting poor and ending up in prison. And we don't need that. If we want to give people a good life, we have to eradicate cultivation and production. Thank you. May God bless our women and young people.
Let us go offering for the Guyana. Let us go offering for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man